he shed neurotic behavior patterns. But this is not a true psychedelic. So what we're assuming is that about 500 or 1,000 years ago, sometime in that span, the Sephora cult was replaced by the peyote cult, which came from a much smaller usage area. Then also in Southern California, there were what were called the Tolach religions, religions of datura intoxication, initiation of young men by intoxicating them with datura and leaving them in the wilderness to fend for themselves. Again, this comes close to being an ordeal poison, although it also has psychoactive properties, but so confusing, such a deliriant, that it bears no relationship to the true hallucinogens, which, with the exception of mescaline, I believe all fall into the category of the indoles. Now, mescaline is not an indole, it's an amphetamine, closely related to MDA and MDMA. But it is a true hallucinogen at fairly high doses. The indoles, which are this structurally related small family, they seem to be visionary extatogens. And I will mention as I go through the list which ones are indoles and which ones are not. Well, no, the only one which is an amphetamine is mescaline, so we needn't.
So you have indole and non-indole.
Indole and non-indole. A kind of parallel phenomenon to the peyote cult of the Southwest is in the deserts of northwestern Peru. There are very large columnar cacti in the genus Trichoceros that contain mescaline. And they have been used for a long time, a lot longer than peyote. We have Mocha ceramic dated to before 1000 BC, which show, in fact, doesn't somebody wearing, yes, this gentleman has the T-shirt. This is a Peruvian design. Point out yes, that's the chunk of San Pedro being held by this dwarf-like little demon. This is a fang demon, Mocha design, 1,500 years old. Now, in central Mexico, we come upon the first of these large centers of hallucinogenic use in the cultural area in which the Olmec arose, were subsequently succeeded by the Maya, were subsequently subjugated by the Toltecs, and the of several species, and second of all, morning glories of at least two types, convolvulaceae, which contain LSD-like alkaloids active in the milligram range that are highly visionary. And there's considerable evidence in the Codex Vindobonensis and in some of the Mayan ceramics that this was a culture that made a very important place for hallucinogens, and that it was the privilege of the priestly class, and that their obsession with calendrics and astronomy and this sort of thing was also somehow intimately connected to their interest in the psilocybin mushrooms. And again, one of these botanical puzzles. Here is a cluster of 10 or 15 species in central Mexico of mushrooms, and a culture builds itself around them. A similar cluster of species on the northwest coast, the culture seems to totally ignore it and have no use for it. And nowhere else on Earth are there clusters of species of psilocybin mushrooms with a long history of use. Naturally, the export of cattle throughout the warm tropics has allowed the coprophytic mushrooms, the mushrooms which grow on manure, to be spread throughout the warm tropics. And then in places like England and France, you get the occurrence of the diminutive psilocybin mushrooms, Lanciata. But again, only the most unconvincing evidence of traditional use. I mean, I am Irish, Celtic. I would love to have somebody come up with a bunch of evidence that ancient Celtic and Druidic art and magic was somehow related to mushrooms. But to date, the efforts have been unconvincing to any skeptic. It may still be there. Perhaps in heraldic devices, someone should go back and study the escutcheons of the families of medieval Europe. And you do find, for instance, the Morel family, Morelli, noble Italian family, mushrooms on the family coat of arms, and other families in France whose names escape me. Agar. Yeah, although that is a coincidence, not
well, I mean,
historical.
not yeah, but still, that name.
Will the sergeant at arms. Okay, so, let me say something a little bit more about the Morning Glory complex, because it's very interesting. LSD, discovered by Albert Hofmann in 1937 and so forth, comes from ergot, comes from an organism called Claviceps, or Claviceps paspali, which is a smut which grows on ergot, a humbler organism. You could hardly imagine. I mean, this is basically yuck, is how you would describe this organism if you were to come upon it. It looks like a mistake, because it's just an amorphous, slimy black mess growing on certain cereal grains. And one of the fascinating questions to these chemists, once they discover a new compound, is to try and figure out, does it occur anywhere else in nature? Some plants, some fish, some something, and then you can form theories and judgments about evolutionary relationships. So Albert Hofmann, the discoverer of LSD, was amazed when carrying out analytical work for Gordon Wasson on magic morning glory seeds that had been sent to Wasson from Schultes. He discovered the same compounds, or very closely related compounds, as he had synthesized to make LSD. I'm going to slightly jump around here now and say that in India, there are 13 species of morning glories in a different family, not in the family Ipomoea or the family Turbina, which are the Mexican families, but in the family Argyrea of morning glories, which contain these ergotamine-like compounds. And this is the Hawaiian baby woodrose. Again, the interesting thing is there is no evidence that ancient India, with its obsession for altered states of consciousness, ever utilized any of these Asian morning glories. So this would be something somebody would want to look at. Did you want to say something?
Just that probably you would never be able to get any hardcore data on the use of mushrooms in Arthurian times, but I was delighted to note in the midst of Avalon, when Morgane was supposedly banished, one of the little fairies from Avalon left her some mushrooms to accompany her on some of her journeys. I don't know if you remember that part.
I remember that part.
Yeah, and I went, whoa!
Well, Marion Zimmer Bradley lives in the hills of Berkeley. We can assume she's fully installed and hooked into the myths of the counterculture. But it would be great. Someone told me that they went to the island of Iona, I think it is, which is where the Book of Kells was supposedly composed. And they said there were mushrooms everywhere, that it was just to be there is to be inescapably confronted with mushrooms, and yet this doesn't, no tradition, no mention. Yeah, off the coast of England. It's where St. Columba came St. Columba came and reintroduced Christianity into England in the 900s. Christianity had died out in England. It was only in the advanced Celtic civilizations on the fringes of the British landmass that the Christian tradition was preserved.
The other connection, this may fascinate you or not, but the misinterpretation and deterioration of the etymology of hallucinogen into its delusional semantic meaning, kind of catalyzed in my brain how mythology has de-evolved into a lie. And if you look up the original meaning of mythology, it means the mutterings of eternity.
That's a great meaning. Yes, the mutterings of eternity.
Mythos and the whole thing with Avalon being sort of that place between the worlds that one went to, the mystical part, and then Glastonbury is sort of the other place where all this Christianity existed. And when I was in a mushroom experience one time in a circle and said I was a recovering Catholic, trying to evolve myself and find out what my mind was all about, and this one man, shaman student from down in the Amazon, he said, well, if you eat these mushrooms, you're going to be excommunicated because the Christians will tell you that once you eat the mushrooms, you're doomed forever to hell and Satan and the devils. And I said, bullshit. You gotta be kidding. But I mean, where would that come from? That he was maybe the Christian control. Well, looked at these people and said, look, you just like paganism or everything, just like wipe out their connection with the other world.
Well, it's very interesting that when the Jesuits arrived in Mexico and talked to the Indians and found them eating these mushrooms, they said, what do you call it? And they said, we call it Tianonacatl. Well, when they got their lexicons out and got that piece together, what Tianonacatl means is flesh of the gods. Well, the center of the Catholic mystery is the Eucharist, a sacrificial meal where a small wheaten wafer is believed to be transubstantiated into the body and blood of the Son of God. So then, to place the psychic experience which follows upon a good Holy Communion next to the psychic experience which follows on a good dose of mushrooms, clearly these guys said, this is competition we don't need, we're going to wipe this out. And it is interesting. I mean, think about this for a moment. We grow so inured to these religious forms. Think about the notion of instituting at the center of your religion a rite where you eat your God. And that is what is happening in Christianity. It suggests that this sacrificial meal idea, which can be traced back to even to pre-exilic traditions in Judaism, is probably a memory of a relationship to some kind of psychedelic experience of some sort. Okay, well, let me continue my survey.
I have a wonderful modern-day story about how the cultural experience of using Christianity to I lived in Finland, community for a few years. And in the early 70s, I say mushrooms are not illegal in Scotland. I don't think they are still, but they weren't in the early 70s. And in like 1969, 1970, a lot of people started coming to Findhorn, and people regularly ate mushrooms. And between 1970 and 1973, it was arguably the most creative time at Findhorn. And books and music was being done, and the community was being built, and performing arts, everything. And by 1974, 1975, it was no longer acceptable. And they were trying to just be a very proper state community, totally in line with the Christian Scottish environment around it, even though they still weren't illegal in Scotland. Of course, nobody does mushrooms in Northern Scotland. But and it's interesting, when I arrived at Findhorn in the early 80s, people had even forgotten that tradition had existed. And one person, though, when I was looking at the old ones, I said, how come people are so much happier back then? It looked like they're smiling in these old pictures. Oh, well, everybody was on mushrooms then. This was a man who had lived during that time. He says that, that gradually died out. But it was interesting because he did them for years and years. And at the point that I talked to him, he as well felt like it was not proper spiritual growth and development to be using mushrooms. So,
Yeah, well, I think institutions will inevitably substitute a rite or a ritual for the authentic, for the real McCoy, because then priests can control the pipeline to God, and the parishioner can approach with offerings. But if everybody can have a pipeline to deity, well, then the whole priest scam is put out of business. Done what?
Precisely what you described.
Suppressing?
No, substituted essentially a ritual, i.e. meditation or some kind of trip, for the experience, and then empowered the priests, i.e. the kind of Buddhist masters. In other words, has that process that you're describing in Christianity, which I buy,
Happened in Buddhism.
Yeah.